on the dusty main thoroughfare of Millfield, while inquisitive townspeople assembled around the improvised auction platform. Thomas attempted to maintain his dignity, though humiliation coursed through him like fire. He'd never experienced a girl's kiss, never clasped a woman's palm, and now faced being sold like cattle to settle the arcs of dollar debt his father owed Vincent Cray, the territory's most merciless loan shark across 3 counties. Cray smiled as he positioned himself close to the stage with a gleaming gold tooth. The man enjoyed seeing families destroyed by financial obligation. The elderly Peterson, who required laborers for his strenuous copper excavation, Jake Morrison, whose ranch workers rarely endured more than 6 months, and an unexpectedly unfamiliar woman had expressed interest. She donned a navy dress, functional yet finely crafted, with copper-colored hair secured beneath a broad hat. Her emerald gaze examined Thomas with such focus that it unsettled him. She possessed herself with understated assurance, despite the fact that her work-roughened hands suggested physical labor and gave the impression of approaching 30. Peterson said, his voice gravelly from decades of shouting orders in the excavations, $200. $250, Morrison countered, expelling tobacco liquid into the earth. The woman extended an arm. $3,100. A whisper swept through the assembly. Women rarely participated in debt auctions, particularly against established gentlemen. Thomas found himself staring at her, wondering what she might want from him. Peterson snarled, clearly enraged by the competition. $350. Without pause, she replied, $500. The gathering became silent. That sum exceeded most men's annual earnings. Peterson left quietly grumbling after shaking his head. Morrison glanced between the mysterious woman and his remaining funds, giving the impression of being uncertain. Thomas' heart raced as he observed the stranger wagering on his future. He understood nothing about her, neither her identity, her motives, nor why she appeared prepared to invest such an amount for a youth who would never perform demanding labor. With his mallet raised, the auctioneer declared, $500, first call. Morrison started to raise his palm, but he stopped and backed off. Third call. The woman's gaze met Thomas across the crowd. For an instant, something passed between them. He could not name anything else, not sympathy. She seemed to see him as an individual rather than just as another problem to solve. Sold to the lady for $500. Thomas' chest appeared to resonate as the hammer fell with a sharp crack. The crowd began dispersing, but he remained motionless on the platform, staring at the woman who now poses him. She approached gradually, retrieving a leather pouch from her coat. Evidently contained, Vincent Cray counted the money. Pleasure conducting business with you, ma'am. Hope you receive your investment's worth from the boy. She surrendered the coins without removing her attention from Thomas. I'm going to. As the bindings around his wrists were severed, Thomas rubbed the irritated skin and attempted to comprehend what had occurred. This woman had rescued him from the mines of Morrison's brutal ranch, but at what price? What did she anticipate from him? He could smell the leather and lavender scent as she got closer. My name is Clara Delmont. I'll be going with you. But as she turned to go, Thomas saw something that chilled his blood. 3 mounted men were sitting at the town's edge, watching the events with a dangerous amount of attention. He was certain that the Sam men had been following Vincent Cray around town the week before. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Clara's wagon was being watched as it steadily moved along the dirt road from Millfield. He sat alongside her on the wooden seat, stealing glimpses at the woman who would just purchase his freedom, or perhaps his bondage. She mastered the reins with ease and remained focused on the road ahead. Thomas finally heard his voice after the silence between the two of them lasted for some time. Ma'am, I must inquire, what precisely do you anticipate from me? He was not immediately regarded by Clara. Can you write and read? He was surprised by the inquiry. Yes, ma'am. Before she died, my mother taught me. Good. Can you handle animals? Some. We had a few chickens and a dairy cow previously. He paused, hesitant to talk about his father's gambling and drinking. Before your father lost everything to winds and Cray, she concluded matter-of-factly. I know the tale, Thomas. Half of the county comprehends Harold Whitmore's decision to leave his son to pay off the debt after he consumed his farm through alcohol. Heat rose to Thomas' face. The disgrace of his family's reputation pursued him everywhere. Yes, madam. Clara finally turned to study him, and he was struck again by those penetrating emerald eyes. I don't care about your father's mistakes. I'm interested in whether you are prepared to labor diligently and learn. I am, he responded quickly. Whatever you require, I'll accomplish it. A slight smile touched the corners of her mouth. We shall discover that. As they crested the hill, Thomas glimpsed Clara's property for the first time. The ranch spread out beneath them like a picture. Rolling meadows with cattle, a sturdy two-story farmhouse with a porch outside, and a few well-kept outbuildings. He had not expected a small homestead here. This belongs entirely to you, he asked, unable to conceal his wonder. Clara responded with evident pride, every acre. Built it with my late husband over 8 years. Been managing it alone for the past 2. Thomas made quick mental calculations. The fact that a woman who was only a few years older than he was could have such a successful ranch was almost unheard of. The majority of widows left and returned to their families. How do you handle everything on your own? Clara's expression hardened slightly. With care and assistance, when I can find workers who don't think a woman can't tell the difference between a steer and a bull. They approached the house, and Thomas observed how well everything was maintained. The fences stood straight and strong, the barn roof showed recent repairs, and the cattle appeared healthy and well-nourished. This woman clearly knew what she was doing. But as Clara stopped the wagon near the house, Thomas spotted something that made his stomach clench. Fresh wagon tracks in the dirt, tracks that didn't match Clara's wagon, and they led directly to the front porch. Someone's been here, he said quietly. Following his gaze, Clara became very still and instinctively moved her hand to something beneath her coat that looked like a small pistol. Stay close to me, she whispered, and don't attempt anything heroic. They cautiously descended from the wagon. The front door stood slightly ajar, though Thomas was certain Clara would have secured it before departing for town. An upstairs window that should have been shut stirred the curtains. Clara pulled out her gun and held it low but ready. Thomas, I need you to walk behind me and keep your eyes on those trees over there. If you see any movement, you tell me immediately. As they approached the house, Thomas' heart hammered against his ribs. He'd been sold, purchased, and now possibly walked into some kind of danger all in the same day. But something about the way Clara moved, confident and alert, made him feel oddly safe despite the circumstances. They reached the porch steps when Clara suddenly stopped. "Pay up" had recently been carved into the wooden railing there. But the realization that the 3 men from the town had not been watching the auction out of curiosity was what made Thomas' blood freeze. They'd been watching to see who would buy him. With her pistol raised, Clara opened the front door with her boot. Thomas could smell something odd, the lingering scent of tobacco and unwashed men, despite the house's airy silence. They definitely had visitors. There were signs of a search in the main room. Drawers were opened, papers were all over the floor, and the cushions were overturned. But it wasn't random destruction. Clara whispered, slightly lowering her weapon. Whoever had been here was looking for something specific. They wanted me to know they'd been here. Otherwise, they would have been more careful. Clara grabbed Thomas' wrist as he bent to pick up some of the scattered papers. He felt an unexpected jolt from her touch, the first time a woman had touched him other than his late mother's maternal affection. She whispered, "Don't touch anything yet. We must determine what they wanted." They proceeded carefully through the house. The kitchen had been ransacked, but the expensive china remained untouched. The safe in Clara's office was unlocked but appeared to be empty. Her bedroom on the second floor showed signs of a thorough search, but her jewelry box remained unmoved on the dresser. Thomas said, trying to ignore how intimate it felt to be in her private space, They weren't here to rob you. Clara gave a grim nod. They were looking for documents, most likely financial records or land deeds. Through the curtains, she moved to the window. Whether they found what they wanted is the question. As she watched the tree line, Thomas looked at her profile. The afternoon light caught the auburn highlights in her hair, and he found himself noticing the determined set of her jaw, the elegant line of her neck. Never had he been with a woman as beautiful, capable, and mysterious as this. It made him acutely aware of his own inexperience. "Why did you purchase me at all?" he asked abruptly. As she turned away from the window, Clara's carefully controlled expression faltered for a while. He caught a glimpse of something vulnerable underneath, loneliness, perhaps, or fear she was trying not to show. She stated simply, "Because I needed help and because you appeared to be someone who deserved a chance." However, $500 is more than the majority of men are worth. She gave a bitter grin across her face. "Most men in this area believe that I am worth less than that. They've been waiting 2 years for me to fail and sell out cheaply, a woman running a ranch alone." Thomas had begun to comprehend. The men who broke in aren't just random thieves, says the author. No, they're not. Clara moved to a chest in the corner, took out a rifle, making sure it was loaded, and pulled it out. "Thomas, there are people who want this land, and they don't care how they get it." He took the rifle with slightly trembling hands, not out of fear, but rather out of the trust she was demonstrating to him. "Can this be used?" Thomas straightened his shoulders and said, "My father taught me to hunt." "Yes, ma'am, I can shoot." "Thank goodness, because those men will return." Clara moved quickly and with practice as she began to gather the scattered papers. "And next time, they won't be satisfied with just searching." As Thomas helped her restore order to the room, he couldn't help but admire how she handled the situation. No tears, no panic, just determined action. She was strong, independent, and unafraid to confront danger head-on. He had never met a woman like her. However, while they were working, he noticed something that made his chest tighten with worry. When she thought he wasn't looking, Clara kept touching her left shoulder. Additionally, he noticed a dark stain on the back of her dress that had not been present at the auction when she bent to pick up a book that had fallen. She was attempting to conceal her bleeding from him. Thomas couldn't stay silent any longer. "You are hurt, Clara?" She stopped, straightening a chair that had flipped over, and froze. "What are you referring to?" "Your dress, there's blood on the back." He set down the papers he'd been organizing and moved toward her. "When did this happen?" Clara's hand flew to her shoulder, and she winced at her own touch. "It's nothing serious, just a scratch." "Where exactly?" Thomas' voice carried more authority than he'd ever used with anyone, especially a woman who owned him. However, he was unaware of the protective instinct he possessed when he observed her in pain. For a moment, Clara looked like she might refuse to answer. She looked less like the self-assured woman who had dominated that auction when her shoulders sagged, and more like someone who had been carrying a heavy load by herself for too long. She admitted quietly, "When I came out of the general store before the auction, there was a fourth man waiting by my wagon. He wanted to know where I kept my land papers because he had a knife." Thomas felt he'd rise in his chest, not embarrassment this time, but anger. "Did he cut you?" "I fought back, got away, but not before he." She gestured vaguely at her shoulder. "Like I said, it's just a scratch." "Let me see." Clara's eyes grew wider. "Thomas, that's not appropriate." "Appropriate?" Thomas stepped closer, and she seemed surprised by the intensity in his voice. "You purchased me to assist you, right? Well, I'm assisting with this. That wound could get infected, and then where would we be?" They looked at each other for a long time. Thomas was acutely aware of how close they stood, how he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes, how her breath caught slightly when he moved nearer. But underneath the sudden tension between them was something more urgent. She was hurt and trying to hide it. Clara seemed to be fighting some internal battle. She finally gave the kitchen a nod. There's a medical kit in the pantry and hot water on the stove. As Thomas gathered the supplies, his hands shook slightly. He'd never tended a woman's wound before, never been in such an intimate situation with anyone. However, Clara was alone and required assistance. When he returned, Clara had removed her outer dress and sat in her chemise and corset, her injured shoulder exposed. The cut was deeper than she'd admitted, a long, angry slash that had bled considerably. "This is more than a scratch," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady as he cleaned the wound. "You ought to have seen a doctor." And told him what? That individuals are threatening my land? Clara's jaw was tight, whether from pain or frustration he couldn't tell. Dr. Before nightfall, Morrison would spread that information throughout the town. How these men want to see me fail. Thomas worked carefully, paying close attention to her rapid breath intake whenever he touched the tender area. "Why haven't you given in yet? Left for a safer location?" "Because this is mine." The fierce pride in her voice made him look up. "From nothing, my husband and I built this place. We dreamed about passing it on to our children someday." "Children?" The word slipped out before Thomas could stop it. His chest ached as Clara's expression softened and she became more sad. "For 5 years, we tried. Lost 3 babies before they could even." She stopped, shaking her head. "When Samuel died in that riding accident, I thought about leaving. But these dreams are all I have left with this ranch." Thomas continued bandaging her shoulder, but his mind was reeling. This strong, capable woman had endured more loss than most people faced in a lifetime, yet she kept fighting. He said quietly, "That's why you need assistance. Real assistance, not just someone to buy from." Clara turned to face him, and suddenly they were very close. "Thomas, you need to understand something. The men who want this land, they won't stop at intimidation." Thomas saw the fear that Clara was trying so hard to hide when he looked into her eyes. "I'm not going anywhere." He was surprised at how strong the words came out, but when he said them, he knew they were true. This woman had saved him from a life of brutal labor, but more than that, she'd given him purpose. For the first time since his mother died, someone needed him. Clara tried to figure out if he meant it by looking at his face. "Thomas, what you are saying is beyond your comprehension. You will be killed without a second thought by these men. Then we'll need to prevent them from getting a chance." Thomas finished fastening the bandage to her shoulder, but his fingers stayed there for a little longer than was necessary. "Explain everything to me. Who and why do you want your land?" As the fabric touched her hurt shoulder, Clara jerked her dress on slowly. "Marcus Steele, a cattle baron, is in the business. He owns most of the rangeland from here to the state line, but my property sits right in the middle of his holdings. He wants to buy you out, right? He has tried. Offered me half what the land's worth, then a quarter." In order to keep an eye on the approaching dusk, Clara returned to the window. "The accidents began when I refused to sell. Cattle found dead with no explanation, fences cut, workers scared off with threats." Thomas could feel the pieces coming together. Vincent Cray works for Steele. Brave boy. With approval, Clara turned to look at him again. Cray loans money to desperate farmers, then sells their debts to Steele when they can't pay. Your father wasn't the first man to lose everything that way. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. His father's gambling addiction hadn't been random bad luck, it had been orchestrated. They targeted him specifically. "I think so. My southern pasture is bordered by the old homestead your family owned." If Steele owned both properties, Clara shrugged and regretted her decision right away. Thomas felt a buildup of rage in his chest, but there was also determination. "What do you require of me?" Clara seemed surprised by his calm acceptance. "Can you ride hard? Do you aim straight? When men are attempting to kill you, think quickly." "I suppose we will find out." Clara smiled despite everything. "You are braver than you know," Thomas Whitmore. The sound of approaching horses reached them through the evening air as if summoned by their conversation. Clara moved to the window with her rifle, and Thomas followed close behind with his weapon ready. Without attempting to blend in, the three riders made steady progress toward the residence. Thomas realized that they were the same men from the town plus two. Others he didn't recognize. All of them were armed and displayed the rigid expressions of men who were used to violence. Clara Delmont, one of them shouted, "We should talk." Clara checked the magazine of her gun. "That's Buck Harrison, Steele's foreman. It's not conversation, no matter what they want." Thomas attempted to control his racing heart as he positioned himself at a second window. He had never been in a real fight and had never encountered men armed with the intent to harm him. But something in him changed as he watched Clara get ready to defend her home. "Woman, we know you are there." Harrison's voice carried across the yard. "Go out in peace, and maybe we won't blow up the place around you." Thomas caught his breath when he saw Clara's expression. Not fear, not despair, but trust when she looked at him. She was counting on him. "Mrs. Delmont," Harrison called once more. "You have 10 seconds to present yourself, or we will enter." Thomas gave Clara a cursory nod as he looked at her. However, as they got ready to face whatever came next, neither of them noticed the sixth man coming toward the back door. This was the same man who had cut Clara earlier, and he was still carrying his bloody knife. They were both looking for the sixth man. Just as Harrison was about to complete his countdown, the back door slammed open. Clara spun toward the sound, but Thomas was already moving. The man with the knife stepped into the kitchen, eyes scanning for targets, when Thomas brought his rifle but down hard across the intruder's skull. The man dropped like a stone, his knife clattering across the floor. Clara whispered, "Nice work," but there was no time to celebrate. From the front yard, Harrison's voice rose to the top. "Time's up, woman. Boss, let's smoke them out." Thomas saw two men approach with torches as they dismounted through the front window. Clara fired with careful aim, breaking a water trough near the horses. The men swam for cover as the animals reared and dispersed. She warned him, warning shot. "The next one will not be." Thomas had never heard a woman talk about shooting men so matter-of-factly, but as he watched her reload with practiced efficiency, he realized Clara had been preparing for this confrontation for months, maybe years. "Clara!" From behind an overturned wagon, Harrison yelled, "Send out the boy, and we'll make this quick for you." The boy? They specifically desired him. Thomas felt a chill as he understood. Clara had become his guardian after purchasing him at auction. She had made herself a bigger target by saving him. He muttered, "I'm sorry," to her. "I am to blame for this." The green eyes of Clara lit up. "You wouldn't dare. This began long before you arrived." The front porch was hit by a torch that had flown through the air. Flames began licking at the wooden planks. A second torch followed, this one bursting through a window downstairs and lighting the curtains on fire. "We need to get out of here," Clara said, coughing as smoke began filling the room. Thomas' stomach dropped when he realized something as they gathered their weapons and any supplies they could carry. "Clara, where are your horses?" Her skin turned pale. "In the barn." They wouldn't have. She looked toward the back of the house, where an orange glow was already visible through the windows. Everything is being burned by them. The crackling of the flames was getting louder, and it was hard to breathe because of the smoke. The first time Thomas had made eye contact with Clara, he grabbed her by the hand and pulled her toward the stairs. "The roof," he said. "Does one have access to the roof?" Clara nodded, leading him up to the second floor. She opened a window in her bedroom that led to a roof section above the kitchen. Thomas, however, was able to observe the full scope of their circumstance as they emerged. The barn was engulfed in flames, and he could hear the terrified screaming of trapped horses. The front porch was burning steadily, and more torches were being prepared. The men under Harrison's command had set up to block all obvious escape routes. They planned this, Clara said, her voice tied with anguish as she watched her life's work being destroyed. They had no intention of just talking. Thomas looked around the yard, looking for an opening. The well stood about 30 yards from the house, offering the only real cover between them and the tree line. But it might as well have been 30 miles with armed men watching every angle. He then realized that the attackers had missed something. The entrance to Clara's root cellar was concealed by a small rise in the ground, and it was located near the property's back. Clara, the cellar, does it connect to anything? There's a tunnel Samuel dug during the first year. It leads to the creek about a quarter-mile downstream. Her eyes widened as she understood his plan. However, to get there, we'd have to cross open ground. Thomas looked at the woman standing next to him after checking his rifle. Smoke and tears for her burning home, her dying horses, and the life she was watching vanish streaked her face. However, her grip on her weapon was firm. He told her, "When I start shooting, you run for that cellar. Don't turn around and don't wait for me." He was grabbed by Clara. "No, Thomas, you won't make it to the cover. Maybe not, but you will." He was unable to read her expression as she briefly stared at him. Then, to his complete shock, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was quick, desperate, tasting of smoke and fear, but it was the first kiss of his life. "Don't you dare die on me, Thomas Whitmore," she whispered against his lips. However, neither of them saw Harrison's final man emerge from the trees directly between them and the cellar as Thomas prepared to sacrifice himself to save her. Thomas spotted the gunman at the same moment the man raised his rifle toward Clara. Without thinking, Thomas threw himself off the roof, tackling the shooter just as his weapon discharged. They hit the ground hard, rolling in the dirt as they fought for control of the gun. The man was bigger and stronger, but Thomas felt like he was fighting for the first person he had ever trusted. He was able to free the rifle and swing it like a club, hitting the man in the temple. The gunman went limp. "Thomas." Clara dropped from the roof behind him, landing with a grunt of pain as her injured shoulder hit the ground. "Are you hurt?" He helped her to her feet, acutely aware of how close they stood, how her body trembled against his. "I'm fine, but we need to move now." They ran across the open ground toward the cellar, expecting bullets to find them at any moment. However, Harrison's remaining men seemed to believe that their targets were still trapped inside the burning house, so they kept their attention on it. When Clara yanked open the cellar door, it revealed dark wooden steps. They descended quickly, Thomas pulling the door shut behind them just as shouts erupted from the yard. Someone had found their unconscious companion. The cellar was cramped and musty, filled with preserved goods and farming supplies. But at the far end, partially hidden behind sacks of grain, Thomas could see the entrance to Samuel's tunnel. "This way," Clara whispered, leading him into the narrow passage that her late husband had carved through earth and stone. They crawled through the tunnel in darkness, Clara ahead of him, both trying to move quietly despite their urgency. The space was barely wide enough for one person, and Thomas found himself acutely aware of Clara's proximity, the sound of her breathing, the brush of her skirt against his hands. They emerged near the creek bank, concealed by tall grass and overhanging willows, after what appeared to be hours but was probably only minutes. They could make out the orange glow of the burning ranch behind them and hear the distant screams of angry men looking for their escapee prey. Clara looked defeated for the first time since he'd met her as she kneeled beside the water. Her home was gone, her livestock dead, her life's work reduced to ashes. Thomas knelt next to her and said quietly, "I'm sorry. All of this is because of me." With tears and dirt on her face, Clara turned to face him. "Thomas, no. This would always transpire. I just got a reason to fight back instead of fleeing because of you. What are our next steps?" Clara stared at the flowing water below their feet for a long time in silence. He was taken aback when she finally spoke, with a determination in her voice. "We go to Carson City's territorial marshal. I've been gathering evidence of Steele's land grabbing for months. We finally have enough to bring him down with tonight's attack. That's a trip that takes 2 days through dangerous country." "I know." Standing, Clara removed the dust from her dress. "And Steele's men will be on the lookout for us every mile." Thomas stood beside her as the moonlight illuminated her profile. "Clara, I need to tell you something. Something I ought to have said earlier." He saw something in her eyes that made his heart race as she turned to face him. "What's it about?" Thomas struggled with words he'd never said to anyone. "It wasn't just fear or despair when you kissed me back there. At least not for me." Clara stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes even in the dim light. "Then what was it?" But the sound of hoofbeats reverberated in the direction of the burning ranch before Thomas could respond. Harrison's men had found their trail. Clara grabbed Thomas' hand and pulled him deeper into the creek bed, using the water to mask their tracks. Staying low among the banks, reeds, and cattails, they moved as quietly as they could. Harrison's irate voice ordered his men to spread out and search both sides of the creek as the hoofbeats got closer. Thomas could hear them thrashing through the underbrush, getting nearer with each passing minute. Clara whispered, pointing to a small pool downstream created by a fallen log. "Underneath, we can hide." The chilly water soaked through their clothing as they waded toward the temporary shelter. The torchlight flickered across the water where they had been standing as they ducked under the log. "I'm sure you are somewhere out here," Harrison exclaimed. "Steele is offering $1,000 for the woman, whether she is alive or dead, and $500 for the boy." Clara's body was warm despite the cold water because she was pressed against Thomas in the confined space beneath the log. He could feel her heart beating rapidly against his chest, could smell the faint scent of lavender that somehow persisted despite everything they'd been through. "Thomas," she whispered so quietly he could barely hear her, "what you were going to say before." "I cherish you." They were both taken aback by how quickly the words came out. "I know it's crazy, and I know After another hour of hiding, they finally emerged alive, drenched and shivering. They had a chance to get away from Harrison's men because the pursuit had moved on. Clara put her hand in his as they made their way toward the main road through the early morning darkness. "Thomas, you ought to know something. I didn't just bid out of pity when I saw you on that auction block." "What happened?" "You appeared to be someone who understood loss and would fight for something that was worth having," she said. His hand was squeezed by Clara. "I was correct." They watched as Marcus Steele, Buck Harrison, and Vincent Cray were issued arrest warrants in the territorial marshal's office in Carson City 3 days later. The entire land-grabbing operation was brought down by Clara's meticulously preserved evidence and the testimony of other victims. The real victory, on the other hand, came 6 months later when Thomas and Clara were on the porch of their rebuilt home and watched the sunset paint their restored ranch gold. One of the territory's most successful ranches now had a partner in the young man who had been sold as livestock. With her wedding ring shining in the waning light, Clara leaned against his shoulder. "Do you have any regrets about not having your freedom?" Thinking back to the timid, inexperienced boy who had been on that auction block, Thomas wrapped his arms around his wife. He spoke quietly. "Freedom isn't about being alone. It's about deciding which group you want to be a part of." With Clara in his arms, he could see their future in her green eyes, years of working together to build something lasting and possibly even the children they both desired. Sometimes the best things in life came from the worst circumstances. Selling oneself was sometimes really saving oneself. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel because we have more amazing Old West tales of love, bravery, and redemption. Now, to hear a story that is even better than this one with a twist that is so powerful you won't forget it soon, click on the video on the screen.